The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep. One last time. Yes!
Let this be the hour when we draw swords together.
Fell deeds awake. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and the Red Dawn!
Your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done.
All right, it is time for another Tabletop Tune-Up, friends. I'm your host, Ben Dyer, here with my co-host, Mark Lehman. Say hello, Mark.
Hello.
All right. Hey, we have a new episode today. Mark, how have things been going with you? How's your games running?
Yeah, it's things are going well. Games are moving. I can't complain. How about yourself?
I got to tell you, you've been asking me every now and again, are you feeling the urge to come back? Are you going to be feeling the impulse and building something new? And I think I'm starting to see my way to a new game that I'm going to run. And I think I'm going to do it without Gund. I think I'm going to make a new kind of cinematic modern action experience.
Okay. Now, I know you had a game a few nights ago. Is that kind of the spark that you needed?
I finished a game yesterday that was my last in a series with Broken Compass, using their Season 1 Golden Age setting. Mm-hmm. I think it was really good. We had a great finale, and I think what was great about it was that once you kind of get your head wrapped around this game, as we've been saying, and you kind of realize you're doing a movie, huge tension, lots going on. I think especially in pulp, people are aware that you can die or apparently die. And, you know, at least at that point, they're going to be out of the game for a while. So we had a great time. It was a lot of fun and wrapped that game up. So I'm probably going to run another game in the sort of the 2.0, the outgun system we've talked about before, but I think it's going to be a modern game.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds great. I wish you all the success on that, but it's good to get you out of, more importantly, it's good to get out of the slump.
That's right. Well, it's good to come back from a break refreshed. Let's say that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you weren't in a slump.
Yeah.
But you were not feeling the GM spirit at the moment.
That's right. So, yeah, it's good to
get
back.
We're talking about today, Ben, because this will get you in the GM spirit right here. We're talking about mass combat, running those big, huge battles. Like at the opener, we had Helm's Deep they were talking about. These are the scenes you often want to see at the table as a player, and they always seem to fall short, don't they?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I remember when I first started GMing, there were a lot of different approaches. You didn't really kind of know how to do this stuff. And so one approach that was kind of like, should I do it this way? Was like, do I get a whole bunch of like character sheets together for average soldiers and then try to run down these combats that have like 20 people on a side in addition to my player characters? Do I do that? Well, no, that kind of bogs things down and it's kind of a pain. And so today, friends, we're going to talk about different ways you can manage this within your game, make it fun, make it memorable, but also make it manageable, something that you can actually do within a reasonable amount of time without doing a whole lot of bookkeeping.
And folks, there are so many different ways to do this. Like there are so many ways, and the way that works for you is the right way. The way that works for your group is the right way. We're going to give you a few ideas that have worked with us and some things that maybe that have not worked with us. And because we've been doing this for a long time, and God, we've had some real failures and we've had some real successes.
There have been some highs and lows.
Yeah. And I think it was one of those things too. The first time I came across this as a GM, I was like, I don't even know what to do. Like, I don't even know how this is supposed to look like. And I wasn't prepared. It didn't feel very good. The experience wasn't what I had in my head. And over years of doing this, it just got a little easier.
Yeah. Well, so I think let's take a minute and kind of think about our inspirations here. So, when you think of like the great battles that you might want to see in a game, like what are some examples of those kinds of things? Are they things from movies? Are they big complex events? Like, what is your kind of inspiration here?
I mean, obviously, Lord of the Rings. I mean, the intro there kind of says it all. That's what I want to feel. I want to
Yeah,
feel that like oppressiveness of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. You're staring them down at the wall of Minas Tirith. And that could be like in Game of Thrones. You got that big battle at the end. You want that experience, right?
there's a lot of different battles in Game of Thrones. Yeah, I mean, there's the Battle of the Bastards where, you know,
Hmm.
Kit Harington's Jon Snow is, you know, looks like he's going to be hemmed in and crowded and actually crushed into a big mob, and then things start to turn. We're going to talk in a minute about how to kind of talk about the mood and things like that. But the point here, friends, is that there's a lot of different places you can go to for inspiration. If we're thinking about other kinds of games, obviously Star Wars has a lot of big fleet battles. You'll see some of that kind of stuff in Star Trek too. The Expanse has some of that kind of stuff. These are great science fiction-y
Hmm.
examples. And notice how the pacing of those things goes. Notice
Yeah.
how the different sort of time works in the battles. There's going to be moments when new forces enter the field, other forces make movements that then put you under threat, and so there's a lot of different dynamics that can occur, and how fast or slow those things go, how decisive any of that appears. All of that is a kind of a reflection of what kind of game you're playing and what kind of tone you want to set.
So, what kind of story do you want to tell? Essentially, is what we're getting at. Do you want to tell a story about a battle that was lost, like akin like say Firefly in the beginning? What does failure look like if that's the case? Or do you want to have a maybe you're trying to tell a story where a villain becomes a person becomes a villain, a friend becomes a villain.
We've taken a couple different approaches to battles in games. Sometimes it's very much kind of more narrative, and you're kind of just describing what happens in different points in this battle in different places. Other times you play it a little bit more like a war game on a big map.
Hmm.
That approach, I think, which of those two approaches you go with, you're still going to be telling a
Hmm.
story. That's important. And also, I think you want to know what your players are into. I've actually tried to run a kind of war game style approach, but I had players who didn't really care to play war games. It was kind of a mixed group. One of the players was like, "Yeah, let's do that," and then the other players like, "Yeah, not so much." And so then the result was that it didn't really work well in that combat. And I think the players that weren't so into the war game approach didn't like it. Other players your players out there may like it or not. So you want to kind of figure out what their interests are like. One other quick thing I'll say about this is that sometimes you're playing RPGs that are actually derived from war games, like BattleTech, like Warhammer, and those kinds of things. And so if you want, in some of those cases, it makes sense to, or it can make sense to actually play out the war game that they have already published. And you can play that, and then that can then reset the context. Again, if you've got players that have those kinds of impulses, they like to play those games, great. But if they don't, then you might want to go with a more of a story kind of abstract approach. And Mark, I want to get into that sort of mode here for a moment too. When we're talking about that story approach, we're talking about the kind of tones you could set. You talked a minute ago about kind of like the tragic defeat. How do you do a tragic defeat kind of story? Walk me through what you're prepping and how you kind of pull that off in a game.
You're going to prep it just as you would any other type of outcome. Honestly, you got to figure out like what you want to happen, how you want to happen, and then maybe come up with a few different alternatives of how this could happen, because things might change on the battlefield that might present themselves or unpresent. You got to be flexible. You have to think about the different outcomes and how those could change. But you really, if you're going to have a tragic defeat, you definitely want to have the players not get the game end because of a defeat. You do have to have outs for them in some capacity, an escape.
Yeah,
Uh,
defeat in battle doesn't necessarily mean the campaign is over.
but it could if the players want to go down
Okay.
with the ship. Here's the thing: players will oftentimes fight to the bitter end. So it has to be kind of known that there is an out. So be prepared for that.
for me, when I think about what I'm going to do to set up a tragic defeat kind of battle, a lot of it's going to be related to what they can lose,
Mhm.
you know. And if you think about big battles, they've always got objectives, right? The objective is to break through the gate to the city, or the objective is to utterly defeat that guy and his army, or the objective is to recover the treasure of such and such, right? Whatever it might be, that's something that your players need to go in and feel like they've got a realistic chance of achieving their goal, and they've got to fail at it.
Well, it doesn't even have to be that they fail at it. It could be that they've done their part in this overall battle. They might be able to achieve their goal, but the other people just didn't.
Yeah. That's what I mean, is that the sides,
Mhm.
right? You think about the sides. The player's side has to lose
Mhm.
in a tragic defeat. And so you need to think about what that goal is that the player's side has. And then you're exactly right. You know, like even if the players have all of the things turn their way and everything kind of comes out right, a tragic defeat is one where ultimately something happens and victory is snatched away from them. And when you do that, like what is it that you're hoping to do for the players? Like, are you trying to energize them to go after the bad guy? Are you trying to have a tragic moment that they then have to build back up from? What kind
I
of,
mean, it really
what do you
could be
think?
anything. I mean, it could be just, I mean, you got the classic, waving the flag to usher in the next wave of horsemen, and those people turn from the field and leave, which is what we saw in Braveheart, which was not accurate, but that's what we saw in the film. But like that, now you got a villain. You know what I mean? Now you got somebody they really want to stick it to. Not only that, you got two. You
Yeah.
got the people who are fighting against, and the person who turned their back,
And the
the
traders.
traitors. So it just depends on where you want to go with this. It could be that you want to show what the stakes are for the loss of the war. Helm's Deep, it was a loss in a sense. I mean, that whole place was destroyed. They saved the people, but like you got the feeling that like, oh, this is just one battle, and look what we gave up to win this. Like it felt like a bit of a loss, even though they survived.
Yeah, it was a very narrow victory.
Mm-hmm.
So let's actually talk about victory for a moment. So moving on from the tragic defeat, when you're doing a triumphant victory kind of a thing, what kinds of things do you do to emphasize the victorious quality of this? Is it just like another combat, and then the players are sort of walking through that normally, or what?
It's kind of similar. The players are going to let you know what they want to do in victory. That's the interesting thing, is when they've achieved a victory, the players are going to want to do stuff. They're going to maybe want to have a speech. Maybe they want to rout the enemy. Some might have different ideas, but just listen to your players and try to figure out what they want to do and go that direction, because that's their victory.
So we talked about the player's side and the enemy side. Each side has a goal. So obviously the player side has to win in that goal. I would say for it to feel like a really triumphant victory, I think the players need to play a much more important role in and be more influential in how that comes about.
Yeah.
It's the player's secret mission to open the gate so that the friendly army can get in, or it's the player's secret mission to deploy the magical barrier that will keep the enemy's super spells off of their army. I mean, there could be all kinds of different things you could do, but the important point is that the players need to feel important to that.
That's true. But hey, let's talk about some of the approaches. I mean, we talked a little bit about a war game type approach and how
Yeah.
you could go that route, because I've not had much success with a war game type approach because of the type of games I run. I run kind of narrative heavy games. So I like to keep the camera focused on the players. What are your thoughts on war game approach? How would you tackle such a thing, Ben?
If you're going to try to do a war game style, first of all, you got to have the players that want to play that kind of game. But if you do, it can be a lot of fun, because then not only do they have PCs that they're managing and who are kind of the special characters, they also get to manage all of the armies. Sometimes people who are really into wargaming type games, if you start doing the abstraction and then they don't actually get to kind of move the parts and pieces, it doesn't actually feel like a big battle to them. It just feels like, oh, okay, well, this is just another set of kind of set dressing, as you were saying earlier. And then they're fine, they go through it, but sometimes they could feel like that was a missed opportunity. So here are some things that if you as a GM are thinking about doing a war game style approach, I would keep in mind. Number one, are you actually running a separate game, or does the game you're playing have rules for mass combat? Some games do, some games don't. We talked earlier about playing games like BattleTech or Warhammer as war games alongside the role-playing games that are attached to them. Those do have different rules. And so, you might want to think about, do those rules take place on a different time scale? Do they mean that your characters are more or less vulnerable and so forth? Think about how influential the PCs are. Think about whether or not your players have to actually learn an entirely separate set of rules in order to play it. That was one of the things that I struggled with when I tried to do a war game approach, was all of a sudden we had to kind of think of some new things. Here's a moment where I actually do want to take a little side plug to Matt Colville's Strongholds and Followers. That's one that's thought through a lot of this stuff. And so I'd say take a look at that. Even if you don't use it, the way he breaks that down is useful and interesting and might give you some ideas for things to try on your own.
It's a good resource. I'll talk a little bit about the abstraction, but you mentioned something in your discussion about how abstraction, you might give the players a little less feeling of like they're in control of the overall war, which let's come back to that after we get done talking about actions, because we kind of stumbled upon something in one of our games that kind of helped a little bit with that. When we're talking about abstraction, what we're doing is we're keeping the focus on the characters. Like if you're a director in a movie, the camera is not leaving the main characters. We're not zooming out to the entire battle, at least not without the perspective of the players looking through their lens. So in this particular case, we're not treating it any different than an adventure. The only difference is you got a bunch of wartime elements around you, explosions, more creatures. Players going to be throwing out those big AoEs, all that kind of stuff. And you're going to be treating this just like you would any other adventure, except the setting is just a battlefield or whatever the setting is of this war. In this case, I think what works about this is it doesn't make the game, it doesn't change the game. If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, it's still the same game you've been playing. You're not switching gears into another system.
Yeah, no new rules to learn necessarily.
Yeah. Stakes are going to be really important, guys. And this is true for the war game approach. All the NPCs you've built up over the course of these games, characters that you've gotten to know and the characters you've gotten to know, those are what's at stake. And you got to make sure that they're in play and they're part of this experience.
That's another way that you make the players feel vulnerable is with the NPCs that are engaged in this thing, and real harm could come to them.
Correct. So what I'd like to talk about is bringing in some wild cards into this game.
You had a really interesting way of bringing in these other characters and other conditions, but without necessarily loading up whole charts full of NPCs and things like that. Mm-hmm. So tell us about what you did with these wild cards. They were actual cards.
They were kind of like layer actions. Think of
okay.
Players in this case were fighting on their home turf, NPCs and characters that they had been building up over the course of the campaign. We basically just made some layer actions. Each one of those layer actions had a card, and the players could once around play one of their wild cards.
So what you're saying is, instead of in D&D, we have villains sometimes that get extra actions that are described as lair actions, and they're sort of special things that have to do with the fact that you're in their home base.
Yeah.
You actually did that for the player characters. You created some specific actions that I think you could only do these like once per round each.
It was once per round. It could also be as a reaction. There was one that was like a reaction card. I can't remember exactly how I broke it down because it was very me running by the seat of my pants, trying something new, which kind of worked. I think if I'd given it a little bit more thought, I might elaborate on it more. But like essentially, they could play these cards once a round. And then I would say, tell me what happened. What did this NPC do? I would say, so-and-so led a charge that took down this big flank of the army, or druids threw up a huge entangle slowing down this group. The players got to decide what that NPC did. And that gave them a feeling of like, hey, this is still a battle, but we got a little bit of control over this, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's neat about that is that you didn't just make it about damage. There's a battlefield effect that comes from the fact that we've got this ally. And there's a different battlefield effect, for example, that could come from the fact that we did these extra preparations before the battle, and these traps came out or something like that. So what's neat is that these cards can really represent anything you want. And so, friends, I'd recommend think about what you could do for just kind of quick one-off effects that could be used to represent other advantages, battlefield units, other things like that the PCs could be interested in. You don't have to have a whole lot of really articulation in the rules to do that, right? Mark, talk about though what kinds of villains these were acting on. You had some mobs, I think, in this context, didn't you?
Yeah, I did broke down some of the mobs into groups. So I had like on the virtual tabletop, I had these single tokens which encompassed 60, 70 little individual tokens that would move around. So I treated these mobs as their hit points as kind of like somewhat abstractions. I wanted to give them the feeling of like how many beings were out there that they're fighting against.
Yeah, what was interesting is that I think the best thing to compare it to is, when you see a swarm, they're made up of little tiny creatures, right? Like a swarm of bats or a swarm of rats. Well, Mark, you basically blew that up to be a swarm of medium-sized creatures, and it took a big amount of space. It was treated as one entity in the initiative stats. You did some interesting things with like area of effect. Like essentially, if you drop a fireball in the middle of this thing, there's not like a saving throw. It's going to hit and damage a lot of stuff, but then you kind of amped up their hit points to represent the fact that there's just a lot of bodies in there.
You got to make it easier on yourself, guys. You could really get lost in the crunch. These are just little shortcuts you can use. I'd love to hear some of the ideas that other people have too.
I think I've seen various ways that people do this. I think the more successful ones have done something a little bit like what you've done, where there were always meta-currencies.
Yeah.
I remember playing a Star Wars game that had a lot going on in it. And in that game, you have the destiny points, I think they're called, where you've got the light side and the dark side, and you kind of flip them.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting as we were going through this whole thing. We were kind of playing it a little bit as a montage, escape from this Star Destroyer. How do you want to get through it? And we could, if we wanted, just flip that light side point and just move. But if we did that, of course, if you know the system, every time you flip a light side point, the opposite side of that is a dark side point, and that was empowering the GM. So the further you went, the less you wanted to use that, because the more power you were giving the GM. And that was kind of an interesting thing to do.
Guys, one thing to think about too, Ben, you've kind of done this in some of the games you've run with some of the large scale events. You've always had like maybe within the massive throng of things that was more like a boss. And I like those treated as a little bit separate. Players are going to be like, I want to take that guy down. You know what I mean? And as a GM, you also have to think about what happens when that leader gets destroyed.
One of the things you don't see very often in the kinds of combats that most parties get into, which are, again, admittedly, like typically smaller combats, you're usually going to have, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 at the most creatures in this. It's not a big battle, right? But especially in larger battles, morale matters. People don't necessarily know what's going on everywhere, and it's very easy to turn the tide of battle if you can instill fear, if you can do some of those things. That's actually kind of another way to empower the players in those settings, is to give them either a boss type character that they can do a duel with, a kind of combat with, or to have some kind of dramatic effect. Wizards especially are good at this kind of thing that creates a lot of fear on the battlefield, and it creates a lot of chaos.
These encounters, folks, push your imagination to high levels. I can't even express how chaotic they can be to run and fun to run, but they are exhausting. Know when to end that combat. Don't drag these out. These encounters have a certain kind of excitement and passion to them. Drag it out for too long, you're going to lose that.
It becomes a slog.
Yeah. Notice how, like in these movies that we're talking about, once Gandalf comes down from that hill and routs them, they want to get back to the players celebrating, the characters celebrating. Don't get drugged down by those last few hit points.
Just to give people a feel for this, Mark, I think when you've done these kinds of mass battle encounters, these are like a session or two. I think a lot of people might think like, oh gosh, if you're going to do a war, a big, huge battle, if you're going to do a Helm's Deep or a Pelennor Fields or something like that, right? It's going to be weeks and weeks and weeks and months, and might take. No, it doesn't, you guys. If you can tell the story and keep things moving quickly, the decisive number of battle encounters could be, the same as you might do in a given dungeon.
It depends on the scale of this battle, how many you're going to want to do, and really how interesting each encounter can be. So think of it small. I know it's big, but think of it a little bit smaller scale as far as organizational.
Break down the things that the players need to achieve in order to get the outcome that they will want in this battle. Think about what kind of surprises the enemy is going to throw at them. And then, I especially love that point about finding who the big bosses are that can really be the special characters that they have to fight in this great war.
Now I want to roll some dice and play in a big battle, Ben.
Well, you know what? We've got something to do before we do that. All right, friends, we have a tune-up today, and this tune-up comes from one of our buddies who sent us something offline, and it takes the form of a challenge, Mark. My friend says, you should unburden yourself from the prison of classes, challenge ratings, levels, etc. He says, try GURPS or Fantasy Hero. Both are great for fantasy games. He says, GURPS leans hard into realism, and Hero has a more sort of cinematic heroism slant. And he recommends other kinds of games to try, Dragonbane, Worlds Without Number. These are games that are fantasy focused, but they don't use a lot of conventions we see in D&D. So Mark, my question for you is, what do you consider gotta have it elements of a fantasy game? Because here we've got somebody saying, levels and classes and stuff like that isn't necessary to have a good fantasy game. Do you think that you do need that stuff because they're sort of D&D conventions, or would you be interested in trying other roads, other flavors, other kinds of systems that don't necessarily take those conventions? What's the minimum to be a great fantasy game?
Is this a fantasy tale you're telling? Does the game system work to tell its story you're going to tell? What I think they might be talking about is, could you play a Conan the Barbarian game in Dungeons and Dragons? Maybe not. Maybe that's not the system for it. But it's still fantasy. It's, you know what I mean? The story is fantasy. I mean, if with enough work and home brewing, I'm sure you could make that game gritty as hell. But you might, to switch to a different system that might accommodate that a little bit better. Maybe GURPS is that answer. I don't know. I haven't played GURPS in many, many years. I'm sure it's not the same game as when I played it in college. But fantasy is the story. Fantasy is the story you're telling at the table. It's not the system.
Yeah, I definitely think people's expectations are shaped a lot by D&D, And so when you think about things like how quickly people heal in D&D, or you think about how effective people are in combat in D&D, or how magic works in D&D, right? Like there's fantasy novels and worlds out there where you have characters that could cast spells all the live long day. There's no such thing as slots. Mm-hmm. You have fantasy games where if you get wounded, you're going to be wounded for a while. You don't heal it overnight. So I think one of the things to do in those cases is to really focus on what it is, kind of to your point, that makes it a great fantasy story. And then I think if you're going to do game systems that people are less familiar with, or that have very different assumptions from what a D&D style game would do, you better communicate those pretty quickly. Let them know what to expect, how this is going to be different from maybe the games they started with.
People play this game so differently than I think I did when I first started playing back in first and second edition. Like it's just a different type of experience when you're playing with young gamers and stuff like that. They're really looking at storytelling stuff a lot more than we ever did,
Yeah, I think we expected the system and the dice to tell more of the story than they do. So
yeah, that's where the whole idea of it was gritty, because the dice were,
right.
We rolled characters. We just rolled straight 3d6, and that was what we just decided. Okay, I think I got stats for a rogue, or
right.
Players have kind of evolved in some capacity. They're telling much better stories than I ever did. I look around and see what people are playing, and I'm like, these are really fun stuff.
Yeah, it's very creative. So I think, friends, when you're thinking about what kinds of things are your sine qua non for a fantasy game, as we always say, talk about it, what kind of game people want to play, pitch that story. And I'd say try some new things every now and again and just see if that sharpens your appetite.
Did you just say a Cinnabon for your players? What was that?
I said sine qua non, that without which not, from Latin.
I'd rather have a Cinnabon.
Oh, okay. Well, you go get a Cinnabon. I'll get to editing this episode and we can release it. And in a couple more weeks, we'll have another episode of Tabletop Tune-Up for you, dear listeners. Until then, keep those dice rolling.
Tune up, level up your fun. now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Level up your fun. Tune up, your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Tune up, tune up. Tune up, tune up. Come get your tune up, it's time for your tune up. Your game needs a tune up. Come get your tune up, it's time for your tune up. Your game needs a tune up. Get your tune up, it's time for your tune up. Your game needs a tune up. Come get your tune